Hello friends, glad to see you on the Crasmodo channel. The YouTube analytics chart shows that you really liked the videos from the A Few Words About Motorcycles series. Continuing this fine tradition, in this video I want to tell you a few words about military motorcycles. From their origins to the present day. There won't be a meticulous listing of every model, but I'll do my best to clearly and interestingly tell you about the most curious, unique, and important examples from the world of motorcycles. Make yourself comfortable, grab some snacks and your favorite drink. Let's get started. As soon as the first motorcycle appeared in the world, it immediately caught the attention of the military. When exactly it was first decided to use the motorcycle as a combat unit, history does not say. Some give the credit to the Kudel tricycle with a 2.75 horsepower engine, which was used by the Kaiser's army to tow light artillery and transport officers. The first photographs of this machine date back to 1897. Others prefer to give the priority to the vehicle presented by Frederick Richard Sims in 1898 called the Motor Scout. Sims built this device based on a licensed quadricycle produced by the New Best-Owned Cycle Company of Coventry. This point is quite controversial since Sims's invention had 4 wheels, but by all other criteria, it was essentially a motorcycle. Based on a bicycle frame and saddle, the Sims Motor Scout was equipped with a 1.5 horsepower engine from the French company de Dion-Bouton and weighed about 200 kilograms. The vehicle was equipped with a Maxim machine gun and an armored shield that protected the shooter's chest and head. The Sims Motor Scout was displayed at an industrial exhibition in Richmond in April 1898. In addition to the machine gun and the shooter, it could carry about 200 kilograms of ammunition and enough fuel for a range of 120 miles. Despite the Anglo-Boer War, where, considering the terrain and long distances, Sims's vehicle could have been useful, it remained a one-of-a-kind prototype. And Frederick, who a few years later also proposed an armored car that shared the fate of the Motor Scout, by the way, decided to focus on peaceful activities, where he achieved success and is considered one of the pioneers of automobile manufacturing in England. I should note that at the end of the 19th century, motor vehicles were expected to have a very bright military future. This is evidenced by the fantastic illustrations published in one of the European illustrated magazines, where, among other vivid ideas about the military technology of the future, according to the author of this fantastic series, the motorcycle will replace the cavalry. At the same time, when depicting the military motorcycle, the artist almost guessed what it would look like, with an armored shield protecting the rider from enemy bullets and a mandatory machine gun for return fire. By the way, the competitors weren't sleeping either. In the United States of America, a year later in 1899, Major Royal Page Davidson created an analog of Sims's invention called the Davidson Durya. Earlier, Major Davidson came up with the idea of creating infantry units in the United States Army equipped with bicycles. Unlike Sims, Davidson, who was almost the same age as him, was a military engineer and primarily developed technical devices for Army needs. The crew of the tricycle consisted of 3 people, a driver, a gunner, and a mechanic, although there was room for 1 more passenger. The tricycle was equipped with a Colt machine gun and an armored shield. Just a year later, Davidson abandoned the 3-wheeled design, and his armored vehicle became almost a full-fledged car. Later on, he also designed vehicles that were completely covered in armor, but that's a whole different story. With the development of motor technology during that period, the need to modernize motorcycles for military purposes was obvious. The armies of all progressive countries tried to strengthen their units with motorcycles. For the most part, the equipment was not much different from standard civilian models and was mainly used for messengers in reconnaissance. And motorcycles with sidecars were used to transport the wounded and as mobile firing points. For the first time, motorcycles reinforced with machine guns appeared en masse in the German army. Unlike the invention of Sims and Davidson, these were modernized civilian machines. Despite the lack of armor, German mobile machine gun posts were successfully used in some operations on the fronts of World War I. The next step in the development of military motor vehicles was the logical emergence of mobile air defense systems. Aviation had already stopped being used solely for reconnaissance and began to be employed alongside other equipment in combat operations. Because of this, there arose a need to repel attacks from the air, so heavy machine guns were mounted on motorcycles. Attempts to armor motorcycles also continued, and the most suitable for such modifications were heavy motorcycles with sidecars. For example, Harley-Davidson. Be that as it may, during World War I, motorcycles rarely appeared on the battlefield. Its main tasks were transporting the wounded, courier service, and the rapid delivery of various cargo. Besides, cavalry still held a significant position within the troops. However, some companies managed to deliver a significant amount of equipment to the fronts of World War I. For example, the Douglas Company managed to sell the troops about 70,000 motorcycles. That was a huge number for those times. After the end of World War I, all participating countries, having fully appreciated the advantages of motorcycles on the battlefield, began to develop new types of motorcycles. Some of them were so futuristic that it makes you wonder, what was the engineer smoking? Here's an armored version from the French René Gillet. This is a 1928 model with a Hotchkiss Memel machine gun, 8mm caliber, and a very avant-garde design. And then there's a whole array of tracked and half-tracked motorcycle prototypes from the 1930s. By the way, there's a detailed video about them on the channel, so we won't focus on all the prototypes here. Here in front of you is the Mercier motorcycle. About 5 prototypes were built, one of which was equipped with an armored shield in the front. During the test, the vehicle literally faced failure. The heavy front of the motorcycle got completely stuck in the very first puddle. And here is the Lyotra prototype. The engineer dreamed of this vehicle conquering the expanses of battlefields, but in reality the prototype was extremely heavy and clumsy. In fact, the Lyotra motorcycle lost to conventional wheeled vehicles in every aspect and was never developed further. And here is an interesting creation by Leonid Kerchevsky based on a Harley-Davidson motorcycle from the year 1932. Leonid Vasilievich was an engineer and inventor. The recoilless gun was his joint development with engineer Isenbeck. And it is this 76mm gun with a range of 5.5 kilometers that you see mounted on the Harley's sidecar. The exact number of vehicles equipped is unknown. Let's step away from military equipment for a moment and turn to police vehicles. In the early 30s, police officers in the United States of America wanted to acquire armored motorcycles. Apparently, this step was prompted by the rampant crime, and gangsters of that era had no qualms about shooting at law enforcement officers with Thompson submachine guns. Essentially, these motorcycles were regular Harley models with a sidecar on which armored shields with bulletproof glass inserts were mounted at the front. The descendants of the Vikings took a much more sophisticated approach to armor. The motorcycle was named Landsverk. Landsverk 190 was the first Swedish armored motorcycle. It was developed around 1930 and sent to the Swedish Army under the name Panzerbill FM 30 for testing as an experimental model. The model was based on a Harley-Davidson motorcycle, onto which several segments of armor were installed. Inside the sidecar, a belt-fed 6.5mm machine gun, KSP M1429, was installed, which served as the vehicle's only weapon. At least one Panzerbill underwent field tests conducted between 1932 and 1935, in the K3 Cavalry Regiment in southern Sweden. In 1932, the Landsverk company produced a new type of armored motorcycle based on specifications provided by the Danish authorities. Under the internal name L210, this vehicle received the official designation Forsaks Spanser FP3 in Denmark. At its core was once again a Harley with a 1,200 cc 30 horsepower V-twin engine. This model was already used by the Danish army at that time, and the FP3 could thus benefit from the unification of parts. As armament, they used a Madsen light machine gun, which was mounted behind a gun shield and chambered for 8 by 58 millimeter ammunition. Armor plates with a thickness of 4.5 millimeters were used, which, thanks to the use of sloped angles, theoretically protected against bullets and small fragments. Compared to its predecessor, the L210 received an armored hull. This provided increased protection on the sides and, unlike the L190, protection from the rear. In practice, FP3 failed. Tests in Denmark showed that the large weight of the motorcycle, namely 730 kilograms, made it difficult to handle. Its off-road capability was minimal, and the 30 horsepower engine barely accelerated the vehicle to 50 kilometers per hour. The tests were suspended, and in August 1933, the vehicle was taken out of service, and the armored body was dismantled that same year. However, the rejection of the L210 did not mark the end for Landsverk's armored motorcycles. Further dialogue with the Danish authorities led to the creation of a lighter version of the L210 in 1934. At the end of the 1930s, the vehicle found an owner. The order for the motorcycle was placed on October 18, 1938, by Baron Friedrich Karl Johansen von Schlesbrugge. According to the Landsverk order log, he was the head of Nazi propaganda in Central and South America at that time, while he was in Mexico. The Belgians used a more economical type of armor. The famous company Fabrique Nationale created the Fabrique Nationale EMS-86 for the Belgian army in 1935. The model for the armed forces received a boosted 600 cc engine and a reinforced frame. However, even such an engine producing 20 horsepower struggled with the additional armor, which weighed up to 175 kilograms. The driver was protected in the front by a massive shield that had a window. In combat situations, the window was closed, and the road could be observed through a viewing slit. The gunner in the sidecar was protected by armor on 3 sides. The military was not satisfied with the motorcycle's performance. The speed and maneuverability of the heavy machine left much to be desired. However, the company Fabrique Nationale was destined for success in the international market. The model was successfully sold to the Brazilian police under the designation Armored Motor Fabrique Nationale M86. Both motorcycles that were built, as well as all the technical documentation for their production, were sent to Brazil. Later, such armored motorcycles were also purchased by other Latin American countries, as well as Romania and Yemen. However, all the batches were small, and only about 100 of these motorcycles were produced in total. Closer to World War II, Fabrique Nationale released an armored version of the model with the opposed engine Fabrique Nationale M12. In addition to various ideas that were not very suitable for real life, the regular motorcycle industry was also developing during the interwar period. This was especially noticeable in Germany. After the end of World War I, under the terms of the peace treaty, Germany was forbidden to produce all types of weapons. However, there was not a word about motorcycles. Because of this, there was a real boom in motorcycle manufacturing in Germany. The main factor for the development of this industry was that an average resident of the devastated country could afford a motorcycle, while a car remained the privilege of the wealthy. This is exactly what prompted BMW to switch from producing train parts to motorcycles and to enter into competition with the second major motorcycle manufacturer in Germany, Zündap. At first, BMW didn't introduce anything new, installing the M2B15 opposed engine on their motorcycles, which was essentially a copy of the English Douglas engine. But by 1924, the engineers introduced the first mass-produced BMW motorcycle created from scratch, the BMW R32. But as time went on, by the early 1930s, the Bavarian company realized the need to create a specialized military motorcycle. That's exactly what the BMW R35 became. Unlike its predecessors, it had a telescopic front fork and a more powerful 400 cc engine. The drive shaft was an important feature for the Army. Production of the BMW R35 continued until 1940, after which it gave way to more specialized military motorcycles. Other significant models were the R12 and R71. The latter became the ancestor of Soviet heavy motorcycles. In addition to BMW, the aforementioned motorcycle company Zundap also participated in the industrial race, fulfilling government orders as well. Zundap supplied the Army with three main models: the K500, KS, 600, and KDers 800. In other leading motorcycle industry countries, things were similar. Companies such as Birmingham Small Arms Royal Enfield, Norton from the United Kingdom, Harley-Davidson from the United States, Gillette Herstal from Belgium, Gilera and Moto Guzzi from Italy, Rikuo from Japan, and others were quite successful in supplying equipment to the military. A separate trend worth noting is the large-scale development of tricycles in Italy and Japan, starting from the 1930s. This equipment gained popularity due to its simplicity and high load capacity, and this made it possible to use it for a wide range of tasks, from supplying units and transporting the wounded to installing radio stations and various types of weapons in the cargo bed. In the 1930s, a huge variety of three-wheeled vehicles could be found in Japan, but the main manufacturers were Daihatsu, Mazda, New Era, and Iwasaki. At the same time, each region of the country had its own market leaders. In Italy, similar vehicles were produced by companies like Moto Guzzi, Gilera, and Benelli. Here, for example, is the Benelli M36 model. The tricycle was used not only for transporting ammunition. When a special towing device was installed on the body, the vehicle was turned into a tractor for an anti-tank gun. During the World War II, the M36 was widely used on all fronts, including as a mobile radio unit and a mobile anti-aircraft installation. And this is the Moto Guzzi Motorcyclo 32, which was also successfully used by the Italian military starting from 1935 when Italy occupied East Africa. As for Army motorcycles in our country, the first domestically produced motorcycles specifically designed for the military were the L300 from Leningrad and the KHMZ 350 from Kharkov. In fact, the KHMZ 350 was a copy of the American Harley-Davidson. However, the Soviet counterpart was much inferior in quality to the Western motorcycle, and it was decided to abandon it. It was replaced by the TIZM 600, which had been produced since 1931. This motorcycle was developed and supplied only to the Army, and in fact, was a copy of the British Birmingham Small Arms. Another interesting but unsuccessful in terms of reliability attempt was the Podolsky Mechanical Plant A750 model. In 1938, the Domestic Design Bureau presented several models at once, IH8, IH9, and L8, which in fact also did not gain much popularity in the Army. And now we've come to the period of the most brutal, bloody slaughter of all time, the Second World War. It was in this event that all those weapons and machines that had been developed over the past couple of decades were put to use. This, of course, also applied to motorcycles. The period from 1939 to 1945 is full of many interesting models. And to begin with, let's get acquainted with the most unusual and interesting ones. The extremely recognizable and quite exotic Neckarsulmer Fahrzeugwerke Kettenkrad. By military order, which the company Neckarsulmer Fahrzeugwerke received in 1940, the Neckarsulmer Fahrzeugwerke Kettenkrad half-track tractor appeared. Such a motorcycle-type artillery tractor was originally developed for mountain troops and paratroopers. For use by the latter, the task was set to create an all-terrain vehicle that could be transported in a Junkers 50-10 feet military transport aircraft. One of the main developers was Heinrich Ernst Kniepkamp, the creator of the running gear for the Panther and Tiger tanks. The motorcycle all-terrain vehicle received a running gear with a staggered arrangement of rollers. developed by this designer himself. The all-terrain vehicle was controlled both by the front wheel and for maneuvering in confined spaces by advancing one of the tracks. The half-track motorcycle Kettenkrad was designed to carry 3 people, including the driver. Its total payload capacity was 325 kilograms, but in addition, it could tow even heavier loads with a hitch. The vehicle was equipped with a 1.5-liter Opel engine producing 36 horsepower, which allowed it to reach a maximum speed of up to 80 kilometers per hour. The vehicle demonstrated excellent off-road capability, which, combined with its compact size, power, and high-quality speed characteristics, was the main factor for mountain troops and paratrooper saboteurs. In addition to the basic version, 2 more modifications of the all-terrain motorcycles were developed and produced specifically for laying electrical cables and communication cables. The first 142 units of the Kettenkrad HK 101 tracked motorcycles were already produced in 1940, and their debut took place a few months later during the landing of German paratroopers on the island of Crete in May 1941. For the first 3 years, the Army tractors were produced in small batches, but in 1943, their production reached 2,500 units. A total of 9,420 tracked motorcycles were produced, of which 1,300 were made by the Steyr Company. By the middle of World War II, Kettenkrad motorcycles had been adopted by the Wehrmacht, and they were also often used as light tractors at military airfields. After the war ended, about 550 more Kleines Kettenkraftrad units were assembled in the factory buildings, but this time for use in agricultural work as mini tractors. At the beginning of World War II, Britain managed to equip a solo motorcycle with armor, and they did it quite simply. During the invasion panic that followed the evacuation from Dunkirk in 1940, an officer commanding one of the reconnaissance battalions stationed in the Hastings sector thought it would be useful to have a more mobile way to move the Bren machine gun on the battlefield. The choice fell on the popular Army model of those years, the Triumph 3 SW with a single-cylinder, 350cc 12-horsepower engine. And just a week later, armor was mounted on the right side, and for counterbalance, a box with ammunition for the machine gun and a 20-kilogram lead weight were installed on the left. According to the creator's idea, during a firefight with the enemy, the driver was supposed to jump off the saddle and take cover behind his armored steed, like behind a parapet, and fire at the enemy with the machine gun. There are plenty of spoons in the case. The motorcycle successfully passed field tests, and the project moved into the military system, where it slowly got stuck due to the lack of motorcycles for conversion and other more urgent projects. In October 1940, when the threat of invasion subsided, the project was quietly shut down. The only converted motorcycle was probably dismantled and returned to regular use. Nowadays, there is at least one recreated Triumph WO3SW, despite the fact that all the leading countries in the world worked on the development of light and heavy armored motorcycles. Most of these vehicles never became widespread. A motorcycle burdened with armor plates lost its main advantages: lightness, speed, and good off-road capability. In addition, it became more complex and expensive to produce, while at the same time its armor did not provide adequate protection. In short, it turned out to be a poor motorcycle and a bad armored vehicle. The military decided, let an armored vehicle remain an armored vehicle, and a motorcycle remain a motorcycle, each with its own advantages. At the same time, the shortcomings of both types of vehicles can be compensated for by using them together in combat. Airborne motorcycles became a separate branch of development during the World War II, and the most prominent representative of this family was the Excelsior Well bike. The Well bike was produced for the British Armed Forces from 1942 to 1948. The prototype of the motorcycle was developed by Harry Lester, an employee of the British Intelligence and Sabotage Service. Considering that it had to fit into a standard British airborne container, which measured 130 centimeters in length, 38 in height, and 30 in width, the Wellbike has exceptionally miniature dimensions. To meet these requirements, the design was simplified as much as possible. A 98 cubic centimeter engine, no headlights, and a brake only on the rear wheel. The tanks held only 3.7 liters of fuel, and their bottom was located below the carburetor. Therefore, the parachutist had to occasionally pump gasoline manually, using hand pumps built into the tank. Nevertheless, thanks to the low fuel consumption, the range was quite large, about 145 kilometers. The maximum speed of this single-speed technical marvel was 50 kilometers per hour, and its dry weight was only 32 kilograms. To take the Wellbike out of the container and raise the handlebars and seat, the paratrooper needed only 11 seconds. To make them easier to find, the containers had special markings, and the parachutes were made from brightly colored fabric. A total of 3,853 of these mini motorcycles were produced. The Wellbike was widely used during the Normandy landings, and especially in Arnhem. The airborne operation was called Market Garden. In addition, they were often used as personal transportation vehicles at airfields. Among the soldiers, the Wellbike earned the nickname Famous James. The motorcycle was a great help, allowing paratroopers to move much faster, but it also had a number of drawbacks. First of all, the container with the motorcycle had to be found, which was quite problematic. The difference in weight between the paratrooper and the container meant that they landed a considerable distance apart from each other. It was not uncommon for containers with motorcycles to land right into the hands of the enemy. This happened especially often during the landing at Arnhem. And the main drawback was the weak engine and the small size of the wheels, which only allowed movement on flat surfaces. Often, the paratroopers simply couldn't use the Wellbike on rough terrain and just abandoned it. A certain number of these motorcycles were sent to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, as confirmed by rare photographs from that time. After the war, some of the motorcycles were destroyed, while others were exported to the United States of America. And this is the Italian version of the airborne motorcycle, the Volografo Airmoto 125. This little one was produced since 1942 at the Turin factory Officine Meccaniche Volografo. A total of about 2,000 units were produced. Since June 1940, shortly after Italy entered the war against Great Britain, a plan was developed for a naval landing and invasion of Malta. The operation was called Hercules, or Operation C3. It was at that time that this army motorcycle was designed at the request of the Italian Royal Army. It is noteworthy that the design was based on a project created back in 1936 by engineer Claudio Belmondo. However, the prototype was only presented in 1942. The first batch of 600 units was intended for one of the battalions of the 183rd Airborne Division Cyclone, which was being formed in the Torquinia area in the summer of 1943. These little vehicles were also supplied to the paratrooper school. The German troops requisitioned the remaining motorcycles in the territory they occupied and handed them over to the Luftwaffe parachute units stationed on the Adriatic coast and in the Rome area. The Aeromoto 125 had a two-stroke, single-cylinder, 125cc engine with about 2 horsepower. Compared to its English counterpart, this airborne motorcycle had a 2-speed gearbox. Under the seat was a 9.5-liter gas tank. With the handlebars folded, Volografo took the shape of a parallelopiped and could be packed into an airdrop container. Assembling the vehicle after landing, removing it from the container, straightening and securing the handlebars took less than 2 minutes. The Americans also distinguished themselves in the production of military scooters. The Cushman Company produced 3 models of scooters during the war. The first was Model 32, the second was the 3-wheeled Model 39 with a sidecar, and the third was Model 53. The first 2 were used for moving around various types of military facilities, such as factories, airfields, and so on. But the last one was intended for paratroopers and was dropped by parachute from an airplane. The decision to create such vehicles in the United States was made after taking into account the experience of Italian and British airborne units using small motorcycles. The military contract was won by Cushman Model 53, and it went into production on February 17, 1944. The motorcycle was designed to be as reliable, simple, and low maintenance as possible. A simple single-cylinder four-stroke engine with a displacement of 242 cubic centimeters, magneto ignition, and a two-speed transmission was installed in the stamped frame. The maximum power was 4.6 horsepower, and the speed that this scooter could reach was around 65 kilometers per hour. The motorcycle could travel about 160 kilometers on a full tank and could conquer inclines of up to 25 degrees. Cushman weighed 116 kilograms and had neither suspension nor lighting instruments. The motorcycle's wheels were similar to the tail wheels of military aircraft of that time. The equipment was airdropped by parachute, which was attached to two suspension points. In addition to transporting military personnel directly, the mini motorcycle was used to carry equipment and ammunition. For this purpose, a special M3A4 cargo trailer was attached to it. If necessary, a Browning machine gun or even a mortar could be mounted on it. In 1944, 4,233 units of equipment were produced, and in 1945 another 501. Cushman Model 53 was deployed both in the European and Pacific theaters of operations. Some of the equipment took part as part of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions on D-Day, in other words, on the day of the Allied landings in Normandy. However, the most common motorcycles during the war turned out to be those of classic designs. From 1940, real reforms began in the German army. Despite the success of almost all pre-war models, from BMW, Dampf-Kraftwagen, and Zündap, the command demanded that manufacturers produce an entirely new class, heavy motorcycles with increased off-road capability. These were two motorcycles, the BMW R75 and the Zündap KS 750. These were specially designed workhorses for off-road movement, equipped with a sidecar wheel drive and a low gear for rough terrain. Both motorcycles proved themselves exceptionally well. However, due to their high price, these motorcycles were initially supplied to the Afrika Korps and airborne units, and only later to the SS troops. The military ordered the production of 40,000 R75 and KS 750 motorcycles, but throughout the entire war, only about 17,000 to 18,000 units of each model were produced. In 1940, the Committee for Armored Troops in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was presented with all the latest motorcycle developments from almost every country. One of the high-ranking military officials asked what the Germans were advancing on. In response, he was shown the BMW R71. From that moment, the development of the M72 motorcycle began. The first batch of these motorcycles rolled off the assembly line in July 1941, already after the German troops had invaded the territory of the Soviet Union. The M72 was practically no different from the R71. It had a simple design, an opposed side valve engine, which provided a low center of gravity and had a power output of 22 horsepower. A duplex tubular frame using variable section tubes. A front fork with hydraulic shock absorbers, shaft drive for the rear wheel, and each cylinder supplied by its own carburetor. An interesting Army prototype was the TMZ-53 with a 1-liter opposed engine and drive to the sidecar wheel. The machine turned out to be powerful, but it didn't go beyond the prototype stage under the harsh conditions of the war. The BMW R71 also made an impression on American engineers. Thus, the 2-cylinder engine from the ER71 was installed in the Harley chassis, resulting in a new motorcycle, the Harley-Davidson 8XA. It was mainly used in North Africa, and about 1,000 units were produced. There was also a Delta prototype from General Motors with a copied engine from BMW. At the same time, the Harley-Davidson WLA, which was a descendant of the civilian Harley-Davidson WL, also went into production, and it differed from its civilian counterpart only by reinforced fenders, an improved air filter, and different crankcase breathers that prevented dirt from getting inside the engine. It was also equipped with a luggage rack, leather saddlebags, and a holster for a Thompson M1 submachine gun. A 740cc V-twin engine was used as the power unit. In addition to supplying their own troops with this motorcycle, the Americans also provided it to their allies, including the Soviet Union, through Lend-Lease. Out of the total number produced, 57,500 and 27,100 motorcycles were delivered to the Soviet Union. This number is greater than the amount of M72 motorcycles produced during the war years. Nicknamed Value-E in our country, the motorcycle was equipped with a domestic sidecar, which could be fitted with a machine gun, an anti-tank rifle, or even a mortar. However, such a set of weapons could also be installed on the domestic M72. On the British Isles during the war, 4 models of heavy motorcycles were produced. The leader among them was the Birmingham Small Arms War Model, 20 with a total production of 126,000 units during the entire war period. Over 20,000 of these machines were supplied to the Red Army. The main motorcycle of the French Army during World War II was the Gnome Rhone AX-2. The basis for developing its own version of a military motorcycle by the Tyrrell Company was the VA model. The new machine was designated VATT. The 2 Terra suffix stood for 2 Terra, meaning off-road. A special off-road device was installed on the motorcycle, consisting of several rollers mounted on the engine protection guard. The solution was original, but turned out to be useless, and it was abandoned in later versions. During World War II, there was a turning point that greatly influenced the further use of motorcycles in the armies of many countries. The name of this event is Willys. Entering the troops in 41, the all-wheel drive vehicle weighing about a ton and with a payload of a quarter ton largely replaced the motorcycle. Taking into account the Ford copies, a total of 659,031 Willys Model B vehicles were produced. The further development of such vehicles significantly reduced the role of the motorcycle in the troops and, as a result, their variety and number. The post-war period could no longer boast such crazy ideas as in the 20s and 30s. Time put everything in its place, showing the effectiveness of one type of equipment or another. Motorcycles, in their classic form, remained in service with the armies of many countries, but they were largely replaced by light vehicles. However, occasionally some strange designs would appear. Apparently, sometimes the creators still found pre-war stashes of drugs. An extremely interesting version of a combat scooter was presented in 1956 by French engineers, who came up with the idea to equip the Italian 150cc Vespa scooter with an American recoilless 75mm M20 cannon. Moreover, the scooter driver would sit right on top of that very cannon while riding. The scooters could easily be dropped onto enemy territory, and then, once on the ground, paratroopers could make them combat ready. The 2-wheeled self-propelled artillery unit Vespa 150 troops Aeroporte can rightfully be considered the strangest weapon of its class. The scooter had no armor at all. The military focused on low weight, ease of airdrop, and high speed, up to 66 kilometers per hour across rough terrain. It was believed that hitting such a small and highly mobile target would be very difficult. The recoilless M20 gun mounted on the scooter had an armor penetration with shape charge rounds of about 90 to 100 millimeters. That was more than enough to fight against the enemy's light armored vehicles. The Vespa bazooka saw action in Indochina and Algeria. The combat crew of the system usually consisted of 2 gunners on 2 scooters. One was used directly for firing at the enemy, while the second was for transporting ammunition, which was stored in special containers on both sides of the seat. In total, the French army ordered and purchased about 800 of these scooters from the manufacturer. Why so few? It all came down to the shortcomings. The 150cc engine was honestly not enough to carry its own weight, plus the bazooka, plus the paratrooper. The narrow wheels created high pressure on the ground, which hurt its off-road capability. The vehicle performed well on the highway, but not on rough terrain. It got stuck in the African sands and sank in the mud of Indochina. Through off-road sections, the paratroopers had to drag this heavy equipment themselves. For this reason, soon the scooter began to be used for its intended purpose. Couriers and communications officers started using them, and the recoilless guns were removed. Italian engineers also presented interesting concepts after the war. At the end of the 1950s, General Ferruccio Garbari came up with the idea to replace the traditional mules used by the Alpini, the Italian mountain troops, with a mechanical means of transportation. To solve this issue, the military turned to the Moto Guzzi company, with which they had already worked several times. Moto Guzzi assigned the contract to one of its most talented engineers, Giulio Carcano, and in 1959 he began working on it. In March 1960, a prototype of the tricycle was presented at the Geneva Motor Show. This was followed by another year of testing and improvements. And finally, in 1961, Moto Guzzi signed a contract to supply 500 motorcycles called the Mulo Meccanico. For this tricycle, Carcano developed a completely new V-shaped engine with a displacement of 750 cubic centimeters, which was named the Carcano V7. The 20-horsepower engine allowed the 1-ton vehicle to accelerate up to 50 kilometers per hour and carry up to 500 kilograms of cargo. To improve off-road capability, the tricycle had 2 special levers with small wheels on the rear axles, onto which metal tracks could be fitted when necessary. Mulo Meccanico had permanent drive to all 3 wheels, a 6-speed gearbox, reverse gear, a disconnectable differential between the front wheel and the rear axle, and a disconnectable differential on the rear axle. In practice, the mechanical mule did not live up to expectations. Operating and repairing such a complex machine required advanced technical knowledge, and therefore more qualified personnel. Another complaint from the military was insufficient safety. As a result, in 1963, production of the Mulo Meccanico was discontinued, although it remained in service until the 1970s. A total of 200 units were produced. Subsequently, in the second half of the 70s, the mountain infantry unit Alpini received a number of half-track motorcycles called Alpine Scooter from the company Pozzo di Riquaro, designed for movement both on snow and on the ground. In the Soviet Union, after the Great Patriotic War, the heavy motorcycle with a sidecar remained in service for a long time. Moreover, such equipment that was owned by civilians was also registered for military purposes. For the Army, models of motorcycles MV 750 and MV 750M were developed. The latter, because of the distinctive humped shape of its gas tank, was nicknamed the Camel by the troops. Training companies were equipped with outdated military motorcycles, the K755, which did not have drive to the sidecar wheel. It was believed that they were better suited for training young soldiers. As armament, they used a Kalashnikov machine gun for the gunner and a modernized Kalashnikov assault rifle for the driver. In case of encountering enemy armored vehicles, some motorcycles were equipped with a rocket-propelled grenade, 7 grenade launcher, and each motorcycle's ammunition load included anti-tank grenades. Soviet military motorcycle units were traditionally part of armored forces, and their motorcycles were classified as armored vehicles. By the 1990s, motorcycles were gradually phased out of the armed forces of the Soviet Union. By the 1970s, foreign militaries had already fully developed their vision of the military motorcycle and its use. To accomplish the assigned tasks, a lightweight enduro motorcycle with reliable components, simple to use and maintain, was sufficient. In fact, the concept hasn't changed to this day. Let me list the most well-known and interesting machines. The Swedish military officials believe that since 78% of the country's territory is covered by forests and 15% is located north of the Arctic Circle, a high-mobility motorcycle would be an excellent way to protect their shared borders with Norway and Finland. In 1973, the Swedish Armed Forces launched a tender for the development of a military multi-purpose motorcycle, in which two companies, Husqvarna and Hägglund, participated. Both companies had previously supplied motorcycles to the Swedish Army, and Husqvarna won the competition with its design featuring two removable side spring-loaded skis. A contract was signed for the delivery of 1,000 Husqvarna motorcycle, 258 motorcycles. The equipment was quite unique. The skis could be attached both to the motorcycle and to the rider's legs. At the same time, the rear-wheel brake control was duplicated on the handlebar. By the way, the 250cc engine was paired with an automatic transmission. The Swedish Army paid 6,000 Swedish kroner, about $1,200, for each motorcycle. 256 purchased in 1968. In 1977, the Swedish Army ordered another 3,500 military motorcycles, and the United States Army bought 1,000. The history of Armstrong military motorcycles began in the 1980s, when NATO forces needed a lightweight, reliable, and simple motorcycle for specific tasks. The British company Armstrong Cruise Competition Motorcycles. Motorcycles built several motorcycles for use by troops. During the Falklands War in 1982, and on a larger scale, the British began producing equipment from 1984. The motorcycle had limited use in the armed forces of the United Kingdom, Canada, and Jordan, and about 3,000 units rolled off the assembly line in 3 years. In 1997, Armstrong Cruise Competition Motorcycles sold the rights to design and manufacture the military motorcycle to Harley-Davidson, which wanted to get a lucrative share of the government defense contract. A separate production line was set up at the plant in Pennsylvania after engineers spent a couple of years improving the 350 version, adding disc brakes and an electric starter. From 1999 to 2000, about 500 Harley-Davidson MT E500s and just over 300 350s were produced. The long-awaited military contracts for the company never materialized due to the large-scale transition of all equipment to a single type of fuel, namely diesel. In the United States Army, you can also find vehicles like the Rokon. This two-wheel drive, all-terrain motorcycle has been around since the 1950s and has hardly changed in design to this day. Austrian KTM made their mark in military motorcycle production in 1985 with a 250cc engine, and in the 1990s with the 400C4, Kawasaki also contributed with the KLR 250 model. We shouldn't forget about the formidable motorcycle units from India with their Royal Enfield. One of India's largest aircraft carriers allows them to exert influence in the Indian Ocean. The new millennium was marked by NATO forces switching to a single type of fuel. And under this pretext, Hayes Diversified Technologies won the tender and created the M1030 M1 motorcycle based on the Kawasaki KLR 650 with a diesel engine, a displacement of 611 cc, and a power output of 30 horsepower. It is noteworthy that the fuel consumption is only 2.5 liters per 100 kilometers. A fully fueled HDT, which is 16 liters, can cover about 600 kilometers. The company needed several years to set up the production of diesel engines and to finalize the refinement of the equipment. And in 2005, the United States Marine Corps adopted the M1030 M1, and subsequently, over the next several years, purchased 440 units of this equipment. The motorcycle was also sold to the armies of the United Kingdom and other European NATO countries. In the summer of 2010, at the Eurosatory exhibition of French defense contractors, the company HDT presented an improved version of the motorcycle called the HDT M1030 M2, Law Enforcement 670. But the expected contract did not come through. In addition to diesel two-wheeled vehicles, the United States Army also made room for a number of Christini all-wheel drive, 450 military all-wheel drive motorcycles. In the 2000s, there was an attempt in Russia to have the military order an experimental batch of heavy motorcycles, which were planned to be equipped with anti-tank missiles and machine guns. The Urbit factory offered the Ministry of Defense a modernized version of the Ural Urbit motorcycle Zavod, 8.1037 gear up, equipped with turrets for PKMB machine guns, Konkurs M anti-tank missiles, and entrenching shovels. However, the parties were unable to reach a consensus. At the same time, the director of the Urbit motorcycle factory, Vladimir Kurmachev, said that the last batch of 100 motorcycles was purchased by the Ministry of Defense for the border troops. Moreover, the factory waited about 2 years to receive payment for the delivered equipment. In the 2010s, electric motorcycles started to gain popularity at a rapid pace, which naturally attracted the interest of the military. After all, an almost silent and less visible in the thermal spectrum electric enduro motorcycle is the perfect option for a scout or a saboteur. Companies like Zero Motorcycles with their Zero MMX model and Alta Motors with the Silent Hawk stood out in this niche. In Russia, with a slight delay, an electric motorcycle for special forces produced by the Kalashnikov concern was introduced in 2018. It is absolutely predictable and logical that further developments in this niche will appear in different countries. Well, my friends, at this point in the history of military motorcycles, we can put a bold, no, not a period, but a comma. In just 50 minutes, we have briefly covered almost a century and a half of the history of military two-wheeled vehicles. From exotic and extravagant designs, heavy motorcycles with sidecars and armored bikes, the military has gradually moved on to lightweight electric enduros. That's all from me. A lot of work has been done, and I hope you enjoyed the video and watched it in one go. If you like this story and are looking forward to more videos like this, please support this episode by sharing, commenting, and subscribing. Now, the fate of this material is in your hands. This was Krasmodo Channel. Thank you.